Hello and welcome to the fifth video for Unit 5, Mental and Physical Health. This video will be focusing on depressive and bipolar disorders. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following question. What are the key symptoms and potential causes of depressive and bipolar disorders, including biological, cognitive, and environmental factors? The first depressive disorder we're going to talk about is major depressive disorder, and this is one of the most common psychological disorders. It's often referred to as the common cold of mental health because of how widespread it is. In the US, between 6 to 10% of the population is clinically depressed, making it the number one reason people seek mental health services. Women are twice as likely as men to experience major depression, with about 1/4 of all females facing at least one major depressive episode in their lifetime. For a diagnosis of major depression, symptoms must persist for at least 2 weeks. If someone is grieving, symptoms must last for at least 2 months. The core symptoms include depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure in almost all activities. Additionally, at least 4 of the following must be present: significant weight gain or loss, sleep disturbances, agitated or slowed down behavior, fatigue or lack of energy, difficulty thinking, concentrating, or making decisions, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, and frequent thoughts of death or suicide. Once all of the criteria are met, a person would be diagnosed with major depressive disorder and treatment would be determined by the psychologist or psychiatrist. The next depressive disorder we're going to talk about is persistent depressive disorder. This is a chronic but less severe form of depression that can last for a year. This is also referred to as dysthymia. This affects about 3 to 6% of the population at some point in their life. It's more common in women than in men and often begins in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood. Unlike major depression, dysthymia doesn't completely disable a person, but it makes life feel persistently gloomy. Symptoms must last at least 2 years in adults or 1 year in children, and includes chronic low mood most of the time, low energy or fatigue, poor self-esteem, difficulty concentrating or making decisions, changes in appetite or sleep, and feelings of hopelessness. Dysthymia can be influenced by genetics, brain chemistry, and life stressors. People with dysthymia are at risk of developing major depression, a condition known as double depression. Next, let's talk about bipolar disorders. Bipolar disorder is a mental health condition that causes extreme mood swings, including manic and depressive episodes. These shifts can affect a person's energy, activity levels, emotions, and ability to function in daily life. Mania is the state of an abnormally elevated mood, energy, and activity levels, often seen in bipolar disorder. It can include symptoms like excessive excitement, impulsivity, decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, and grandiose ideas. While it may seem like high energy or extreme happiness, mania can lead to risky behavior, difficulty concentrating, and in severe cases, delusions or hallucinations. Bipolar affects about 2 to 3% of the population and typically begins in late teens or early adulthood. While the exact cause is unknown, genetics, brain chemistry, and life stressors all play a role. There are 3 main types of bipolar disorder: bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymic disorder. Treatment usually includes medication, therapy, and lifestyle management to stabilize mood and improve daily functioning. If left untreated, bipolar disorder can significantly impact relationships, work, and overall well-being. Let's talk about the differences between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder. Bipolar 1 is defined by manic episodes, which are severe and can lead to risky behavior, impaired judgment, and even hospitalization. These manic episodes last at least 7 days or require medical intervention. While depressive episodes may or may not occur, the defining feature of bipolar 1 is the intensity of the mania. Treatment for bipolar 1 often involves higher doses of mood stabilizers and intensive therapy to help manage severe manic episodes and prevent extreme mood swings. In contrast, bipolar 2 is characterized by hypomanic episodes, which are less severe than full mania, but still noticeable. These episodes typically only last a few days. However, individuals with bipolar 2 experience more frequent and prolonged depressive episodes, making depression a major challenge in this form of the disorder. Treatment for bipolar 2 focuses more on managing depression and hypomania, often requiring lower medication doses compared to bipolar 1. While both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 involve mood fluctuations, bipolar 1 is more manic focused, whereas bipolar 2 involves less severe highs but more frequent depression. The third and final type of bipolar disorder is cyclothymic disorder. This is a mood disorder characterized by periods of hypomanic symptoms and periods of depressive symptoms that occur over the course of at least 2 years. The number, duration, and severity of these symptoms do not meet the full criteria for major depressive episode or a hypomanic episode, so it's often considered to be a mild bipolar disorder. Next, we're going to be looking at the cause or etiology of depression through the biological, cognitive, and sociocultural approach. First, let's look at the biological approach. Depression has a negative component, as seen in twin studies. Kendler et al. Found higher concordance rates in identical twins compared to fraternal twins, suggesting genetics play a significant role, especially in women. Sullivan et al. Estimated that genes account for about 1/3 of depression cases, while childhood environment also influences risk. More recent studies like CASPI focus on specific genes, particularly the 5-HTT gene, which affects serotonin. People with a certain variation of this gene are more likely to develop depression after stressful events. Further research done by Kai identified genetic markers linked to depression, including those affecting mitochondrial function. This highlights how depression may not stem from a single gene, but rather a complex interaction of multiple genetic and environmental factors. While discussing the biochemical aspects of depression, the serotonin hypothesis was once the leading theory. It proposed that low serotonin levels cause depression, while SSRIs, which boost serotonin, help some people, they don't work for everyone, suggesting that the serotonin hypothesis isn't enough. We need a more complex mechanism. A newer perspective is the neurogenesis theory, which suggests that chronic stress and high cortisol levels reduce the production of new neurons in the hippocampus, contributing to depression. Brain scans support this idea, showing that depressed individuals tend to have smaller hippocampi. While genetic research has provided valuable insights, it has limitations. Correlational studies can't really prove causation. Twin studies aren't fully replicable and representative, and depressive symptoms vary widely across cultures. Ultimately, modern research acknowledges that both genetic and environmental factors contribute to depression, making it a highly complex disorder that requires personalized treatment approaches. Next, let's look at the cognitive approach. Depression has long been associated with negative thought patterns, and cognitive theories aim to explain why some people are more vulnerable to depression than others. One of the most influential theories was developed by Aaron Beck, who proposed that depression is rooted in automatic negative thoughts that occur spontaneously and reinforce feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Beck outlined 3 components of his theory. The first is the negative cognitive triad, which describes how depressed individuals see themselves as inadequate or flawed, thinking I am worthless, the world as a hostile or unfair place, believing no one cares about me, and the future as hopeless, assuming that things will never improve. These negative thought patterns influence how people interpret experiences, but how do these negative thoughts develop? Beck argued that they are shaped by cognitive biases, flawed ways of thinking that reinforce depressive symptoms. There are several types of cognitive biases. The first is arbitrary interference, which is jumping to conclusions with little evidence. For example, if someone doesn't text back immediately, a person assumes they are being ignored. The next cognitive bias is dichotomous thinking, viewing situations in extremes, such as believing if I'm not the best, I'm a complete failure. The next cognitive bias is exaggeration or magnification, blowing negative events out of proportion. A minor critique from a teacher leads to the thought, I must be a terrible student. Overgeneralization is next, which is applying one negative event to all future experiences. For example, failing one test leads to I'll never be good at school. The next cognitive bias is personalization, blaming oneself for external events. If a friend doesn't invite you to a party, you assume it was to deliberately exclude you. And finally, selective abstraction. This is where a person is focusing only on negative details while ignoring the positives. So a person is fixating on a single bad grade despite having high overall marks. These thinking patterns often stem from negative schemas, which are deeply rooted beliefs formed through past experiences. Beck identified 3 common negative schemas in depressed individuals. 1 was the ineptness schema. I always fail. 2, the self-blame schema. Everything bad is my fault. And 3 is the negative self-evaluation schema. I am worthless. These schema are often triggered by events that resemble past negative experiences, reinforcing depressive thought patterns. There is research support for Beck's theory. In Alloy et al., researchers found that people with negative thinking patterns were much more likely to develop depression over 6 years. Joyner found that students who had negative thoughts before an exam and performed poorly experienced increased depressive symptoms, while those who performed well did not. This suggests that negative thoughts alone don't cause depression, but when combined with negative life events, they can increase vulnerability. Another key cognitive factor in depression is rumination, or the tendency to dwell on negative emotions and thoughts. Nolan Hoeksema found that people who ruminate after a personal loss tend to suffer from more prolonged and severe depression. Farb used brain scans to show that people who relapsed into depression had higher activity in areas of the brain linked to rumination. Since negative thought patterns could contribute to depression, treatments like mindfulness have been explored. Mindfulness helps people stay present, reducing overthinking and stress. This makes sense from both a cognitive perspective and a biological perspective. From the cognitive perspective, mindfulness will disrupt negative thought cycles. And in the biological perspective, mindfulness reduces stress-related hormone levels like cortisol. However, research on mindfulness shows mixed results. It might not work for everyone. While Beck's theory has strengths, including research support and practical treatment applications, it also has some limitations. Because most studies are correlational, we can't say for sure whether negative thinking causes depression or if depression causes negative thinking. Also, just because cognitive behavioral therapy is effective doesn't necessarily prove that cognition is the root cause of depression. Finally, let's look at the social cultural approach. This approach to mental health focuses on how our environment, stressors, and community resources influence our well-being. Unlike purely biological or cognitive theories, sociocultural models take a more holistic perspective, recognizing that both personal hardships and social support networks shape mental health outcomes. A key study supporting this approach is Brown and Harris, which examined the roles of life events in depression. They found that women who had faced significant stress, such as losing a loved one or being in an abusive relationship, were much more likely to become depressed. This led to the vulnerability model, which categorized risk factors into 3 groups: protective factors, things that lower depression risk; vulnerability factors, things that increase depression risk; and provoking agents, immediate or ongoing stressors that trigger depression. The cultural aspect of depression is also significant. Many early psychological models assumed depression looked the same across cultures, but research suggests otherwise. Parker found that Malaysian Chinese patients were more likely to report physical symptoms like headaches and fatigue, whereas Australian patients focus more on mood-related symptoms. This highlights how cultural norms shape how people express and experience depression. Kiermaier further argued that cultures create explanatory models for mental disorders. For example, in traditional Japan, sadness was seen as a natural part of life, a sign to reconnect with family. But with increasing Western influence, depression is now more commonly diagnosed as a medical condition. This sociocultural perspective has some strengths. It acknowledges both biological and environmental factors, and it explains gender and cultural differences in depression. However, there are limitations as well. Stress is difficult to measure. Major life events aren't always the best indicator. Cultural models are descriptive but don't fully explain why depression develops. And cross-cultural studies face challenges, such as Western research methods may not be universally applicable. Ultimately, while the social cultural approach does not fully explain depression, it highlights the importance of context, showing how our environment and culture shape mental health experiences.